is the Hawks being used to settle domestic issues? Two big stories over the weekend suggest that the Hawks may have been subjected to abuse of power by former Minister Malusi Gigaba after news emerged that the corruption-fighting unit arrested his wife Norma. And it also emerged that Deputy Finance Minister David Masondo reported a domestic dispute to the Hawks. The ANC's Integrity Committee now recommending that he should step down for abusing state resources. Meanwhile, Police Minister Cathy Powell says more should be expected from the Gigaba case. Here is the Minister speaking on Flatten the Curve last night.
I don't ask the details when police do this work. Sometimes I do get the report, but details is for the investigation. But what I have heard on this case is that it's not just an ordinary domestic case. It looks like there are other things, that the conspiracy to murder and all that. So it makes, immediately, it does make a serious case that it falls within the jurisdiction of the Hawks. Remember, Hawks have jurisdiction to any case that they feel is got some form of weight, so they would. But as they continue investigation, there's nothing wrong taking it back to the members of the South African Police special units that are dealing with the issues of gender-based violence and family violence.
All right, let's unpack this issue now. We're joined by Associate Professor of Public Law at UCT, Cathy Powell. Cathy, good morning. Just listening to Police Minister Cathy Powell there, he says this is not just an ordinary case, a domestic case. It looks like there is a conspiracy angle. Let's just remind ourselves of the mandate of the Hawks to investigate organized crime. What do you make of this?
Organized crime and priority crimes. Now, the legislation does include a catch-all provision, which was challenged unsuccessfully, but it does include a catch-all provision to allow the Hawks to investigate matters that the head of the Hawks, not the head of the police, the head of the Hawks, thinks may have some national importance. I fail to see how a single murder conspiracy could do that. But if you consider how many other murder conspiracies are not handled by the Hawks, you would think that Cathy Powell or the head of the Hawks would have a bit more explaining to do. We're dealing with an ex-minister, we're dealing with a deputy minister. I'm sorry, you need to show what national importance there might be attached to these two cases.
Yeah, it's also very worrying that the police minister comes on record, comes on camera to try and justify the Hawks' involvement in these domestic disputes.
Indeed, I'm waiting to hear from Lebeya. I mean, you want to actually hear the head of the Hawks.
Yeah, absolutely.
To explain why they got involved. You know, the Hawks are the successors of the Scorpions, and they've been taken to court many times, to the Constitutional Court, for being insufficiently independent from the executive. The last time was in 2014, and certain aspects were found to be unacceptable, including, for example, that the minister is allowed to set guidelines for whom they prosecute and whom they don't. Now, that was declared unconstitutional by the court. I notice it's actually still sitting in the legislation, but it's invalid. However, it's not just the Minister of Police who seems to be moving the Hawks around. It seems to be a whole lot of other people as well, unless they're going through the Minister of Police, which makes for me the chief concern not so much the people doing the abusing. Masondo saying, you've got to go and arrest my ex-girlfriend. It makes the concern the independence of the institution of the Hawks, because it doesn't seem to be even trying to remain independent.
Cathy, the headlines around, the issues around this story in the wake of some of the other major issues we're facing at the moment around PPE scandals, tender irregularities, how do you read yet another headline questioning yet another organization that is meant to enforce the rule of law?
It is very serious, and you're dead right. It's part of the corruption process. If government agencies can be misused for the benefit of politically connected people, you've got corruption. You don't need to have money involved. You need individuals to have power because they are in government to do things that benefit only themselves. And that's what the hawks are being used for on the evidence that we are seeing. So it's right up there with granting PPE tenders to companies that don't have any experience of providing PPEs. And we've got to take it just as seriously. The fact that there's no money involved and it's only one person who spent a night in jail, that's not the point. The point is, unless our institutions are independent, the people of South Africa are not safe from corruption.
I mean, there are so many angles to the story this morning, and not least of which, as we now go into the month of August, we're going to see a litany of ways in which government institutions pay lip service to the challenges that still face women amid our rising and shocking gender-based violence numbers. Again, this story now shines a light on men using their positions of power to the detriment, no matter what the different parts of the case are, but to the detriment of women ultimately.
Yes, you know, the president has declared it a pandemic, violence against women. That I consider to be a case of national interest. So possibly the head of the Hawks could decide to tackle that at some sort of systematic and institutionalized level in a way it's not being done now. But to do it, in fact, I mean, the two cases that we've got were both cases in which men called the Hawks to act against women. But one of them alleged an assault by a woman. That's not using the Hawks to address gender-based violence at all. And it gives a lie to the idea that one murder conspiracy or the scratching of one car can somehow be a matter of national interest, whereas the death toll and the violence and the assault and the trauma that women are facing is not. So I think August is a time that the Hawks could maybe find something more useful to do.
Yeah. Absolutely. Cathy, while we've got you on the line, I want to talk to you about this issue around the PPE's allegations of tender irregularities with how PPE tenders are awarded. And a lot of, certainly the interviews that we're doing with various provinces and spokespeople in those provinces, a lot of the argument being used is that, yes, the optics might be wrong, there may be a perception of wrongdoing, but it's not illegal. How do we read that?
Imagine that the loophole that they're holding on to there is that because this is a matter of urgency, the normal tender procedures could legally be avoided.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a provision for that. So there's a normal tender process, but it takes a lot of time. If you're dealing with an emergency, there may be some steps that you can leave out. Fine. But if there's a mere coincidence, you leave out those steps and then suddenly all the relatives of the cabinet ministers end up, or past cabinet ministers end up getting tenders, there's still something wrong. And, beg your pardon?
No, please go ahead.
There's still something wrong. So I think it's a bit like this claim where people say, oh, well, you know, they're innocent until proven guilty, so we're going to reinstate the ANC members who are implicated in the VBS scandal. It's one thing to be criminally wrong or even to be against the written law. And it's another thing to behave unethically. And we as the people of South Africa need to demand ethical behavior from the government, because without that we haven't got a true democracy and we haven't got a government for the benefit of the people. Absolutely.
And if you read it again in terms of how corruption affects the everyday lives of people in South Africa, if we read it amid the PPE tender irregularities, alongside the lives being lost of our frontline workers, our doctors and nurses, who for the past few months have been complaining about substandard PPE.
I think that is, you hit the nail on the head. Corruption is bad enough any time, but when it's killing people, when the people actually taking the risk of treating the COVID patients and the COVID patients themselves and the people who can't earn a living now because they're on lockdown, when they are dying because of irregularities or favoritism in the tender process, I think you're actually looking beyond corruption. And it's a bit like Becky Powell has just said about the Norma Gigaba case. There's something more going on here. People are dying. Absolutely. And I think much as there was with the Esidimeni crisis, we maybe want to take this a bit further.
Cathy Powell, as always, a pleasure. Thank you for talking to us this morning on the AM report. Cathy is Associate Professor of Public Law at UCT. We've been talking to her about the issue around the hawks being used to address domestic issues, and that includes issues from Deputy Finance Minister David Masondo and former Minister Malusi Gigaba. But as always, very many of these big stories do relate to so many other stories unfolding in the country.